Podem començar amb les preguntes.
Well, apologies, because I can't be heard, but don't know what to do about it. Well, that's actually an old principle. It wasn't invented by me, but it has long been understood by what are called theorists of democratic practice, that if you can't control the rabble, as they're usually described, by force, you have to control their opinions. Notice that it's taken for granted, and it has been taken for granted since the first modern revolution, democratic revolutions in the 17th century, that it is necessary to keep the general public apathetic, passive, and marginalized. This was an unquestioned principle of the libertarian British tradition. It's part of the founding doctrine of the United States. It becomes highly articulated theory in the more sophisticated 20th century. If you read, for example, leading academic theorists like Harold Lasswell, who's one of the founders of modern American political science, he explains that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the judges of their best interests. They're not. We're the best judges of their interests. One of the leading American intellectuals of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann, who was the most important journalist, but also a progressive thinker and a theorist of democracy, he explained that in his democratic essays that the population are what he called ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, and they have to be kept from interfering with what is none of their business, namely public affairs. And it just follows obviously that if you can't control them by force, you've got to either divert the population in some way or control their opinions, or else do what's being done in Europe now, for example. That is, raise the level of decision-making so high that it's out of the influence of parliaments and hence of public control. In fact, that's happening internationally. The organizations like the GATT, or the IMF, and the World Bank, and G7, the meetings of the 7 countries, they are intended to function as a world government that serves directly the transnational corporations and is subject to no interference at all from the public, because the public has no idea what they're doing. And in fact, this is quite explicitly described in the international financial press, for example. The London Financial Times, which is the leading international financial journal, describes this as what they call the new imperial age, in which the public and all partially representative institutions like parliaments are simply removed from any interference with general affairs. I'll give you just one example from North America, which is similar. Right now, one of the major issues is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. We should recognize that free trade is an illusion. They're not interested in free trade any more than GATT is. They're interested in a mixture of protection and freedom, which is beneficial to the wealthy investors and the transnational corporations. Now, the NAFTA agreement will undoubtedly have an enormous effect on all of the North American population. It supersedes government legislation on things like the environment and pesticides and so on. It'll shift jobs enormously. It's going to have a major social effect. Nobody can really have an opinion about it because it's basically secret. They have even kept it secret from trade union-based organizations that by law are required to review it, but they've not been allowed to look at it. Congress has abdicated responsibility. They said they won't pay any attention to it. And the public has no idea what's in the negotiations. So some series of legislations will be imposed in the interests of international investors, from which the population will undoubtedly suffer very severely, as will the environment. But no one has an opinion because nobody knows about it, and nobody can know about it. Notice that at this point, the threat of democracy, the way of controlling the population has traditionally been force or thought control. But now we have a more sophisticated device. Just eliminate them totally. So they don't even know what's happening. They don't even know that they don't know what's happening. For example, the U.S. press will not report the fact that the trade unions were not given an opportunity even to review the legislation. Because the important thing in a very free, the United States is a very free country. You really can't control people by force. So therefore it's necessary to move to quite extreme measures to make sure that the population does not interfere in management of public affairs. I should say that new technology, like say television, is very useful in this respect, because television has the effect of isolating people. Each person is completely alone in front of the television set. They're not communicating with anyone else. You know, they're not interacting, they're not organizing. Now, if every individual is alone in front of the television set, it doesn't really matter what they think. There's nothing they can do. They need organization to do things, but they're isolated. And the technology is, of course, being used for that purpose.
Sí, la caída de los países del este ha influenciado de una manera decisiva en el pensamiento de la izquierda europea. Yo quisiera saber, en la izquierda norteamericana, cómo ha afectado, digamos, esta situación. Creo que el desconocimiento que hay del debate interno, de la propia existencia de la izquierda en Estados Unidos es bastante notorio.
It depends who you mean by the left. I mean, if you mean by the left what I mean by the left, the fall of the Soviet Union has nothing to do with it. The last traces of socialism were wiped out in the Soviet Union certainly by early 1918, probably earlier. Certainly in this region of the world where the collectives and the workers' organizations were destroyed by communist-led armies back in the 1930s. Nobody should have any illusions about any of that having anything to do with the left. As far as what I would regard the authentic left is concerned, the fall of the Soviet tyranny just is, you know, it's a small victory. It's like the defeat of fascism. It eliminates another source of tyranny and oppression in the world, which is fine. But for the third world, this is much more complex because, you know, it's however tyrannical and brutal the Soviet system might have been, it provided a certain space to maneuver for the third world. It gave them some options which are gone. For poor and oppressed people, it's better to have two tyrannies than one, because the two are fighting each other, and that gives you some space. And in fact, the third world is suffering for that reason. About the entire process, I really disagree with almost everyone who's discussing it, not for the first time. But in my opinion, the East-West conflict was just a special case of the North-South conflict. It's a phase of the Columbian era of the European conquest of the world. The history of the last 500 years is basically European conquest of the world and converting most of the world into colonies. The earliest colonies was Eastern Europe. Even in pre-Columbian times, Eastern Europe was already becoming a colony of the West, and that continued right into the 20th century. Now, one of the principles of the system of world rule is that no one is allowed to pursue an independent course. So if a tiny island like Grenada tries to set up fishing cooperatives, it has to be destroyed. And that you can do in a weekend. If a sixth of the world tries to go an independent course, it has to be brought back to become a third world service area, and that takes 70 years. But that's the difference. In fact, as was completely predictable, most of Eastern Europe is now undergoing a process of what is sometimes called Latin Americanization. That is, it's returning to the third world service role. It's becoming, like most of Latin America, a country where a large majority of the population lives in utter misery, and a small sector is very wealthy and privileged, and of course that privileged sector is the old Communist Party, exactly as was predicted. If you're an investor and if you run a major corporation, you want to set up a branch in Eastern Europe and you want somebody to manage it, the people you're going to turn to are the people who have the connections and know their way around and have been managing for a long time. That is the ex-nomenklatura, the old Communist Party. So they're becoming the Latin American privileged elite. And in fact, Eastern Europe is being compelled to follow the IMF rules. the neoliberal rules, which no successful country would observe for 1 second, but which are designed so that you can rob people better. If any country that follows those rules is going to be destroyed. So it's very good for the third world. No Western country would ever dream of following them. And Eastern Europe is supposed to follow them too, so that they can be robbed. That's what they're for. And predictably, since 1989, when most of Eastern Europe accepted the IMF rules, the economies are completely in free fall. They're collapsing. I mean, there will be what are called economic miracles, just as Brazil is called an economic miracle. An economic miracle means a place where, the 10% of rich people live very nicely. The investors make a lot of profit, and for everybody else, it's Central Africa. That's a technical term of economic theory, incidentally. Well, in the United States, there's only one political party, the business party. It has two factions called Republicans and Democrats. Both factions this time put up conservative Republicans, and the differences between them are very slight. If you want to have a good prediction as to what's going to happen, take a look at the markets. Take a look at the international financial markets. If they thought there was any fear that Clinton would pursue any policies oriented toward the general population, the dollar would be declining, there'd be capital flight and so on. They're quite happy.
Jo li vull preguntar, senyor Chomsky, si vostè està, en la vessant política està organitzat, i si ho està, en el cas que estigui organitzat, quines iniciatives emprèn la seva organització i quines relacions internacionals té?
Well, I'm involved in endless numbers of grassroots popular organizations, from groups that were resisting war to solidarity organizations to community development groups. They're not political organizations, but there's quite a complex and rich network of these in the United States, and they're very significant. And in fact, I spend an awful lot of my life just going around giving talks to them. You can ask those guys back there who filmed some of these things from North America, and that's what I do all the time, is working together with such groups. That's what real politics is, in my opinion. Practically everything I write is directed to those organizations. And in fact, most of what I write is just, sort of worked out from talks that I've given to groups like that, which I do all over the place. At 7 o'clock in the evening, all the major television channels have their major news programs. And the bombing was timed so that this could take up the entire news program. All the television corporations had been informed, so they all had their people there in Tripoli and Benghazi, so they could televise the exciting sights. And of course it was planned. Not even any question. Actually, that's not the first time. It's the second time. The second time that's known. The first time was, remember the Tonkin Gulf bombing in 1964? There was bombing of first bombing of North Vietnam after a fake Tonkin Gulf incident. The secret documents have only now been declassified. And it turns out that the White House told the military to arrange the bombing for exactly 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time so that it could dominate the news. That time, they couldn't manage at that time. The military failed, so it came a little bit later. But the bombing of Libya is very easy. Libya is completely defenseless. It's like a punching bag. That's why the U.S. keeps attacking. It's the easiest country to attack. And that you can arrange so you can bomb them any minute you want. Still, you shouldn't underestimate the success of the management. So the planes that bombed Libya had taken off 6 hours in advance. And they worked it out with a 6-hour flight so they could start the bombing precisely. And all the television stations had their major news programs. In order to carry off something like this, you have to be very secure that the intellectual class is completely servile and won't report it and won't make it public. Because if they make it public, it'll look ridiculous. So, of course, the press and the whole intellectual class kept the whole farce entirely secret.
Sí, que un fet com els plets de violència racial a Los Angeles a primers d'any si creu que ha dut a una reflexió americana en relació amb un sistema que du a la marginació, que condemna a la misèria, que impedeix el desenvolupament social i cultural d'una bona part de la població.
Well, the explosion in Los Angeles is just, a slightly greater version of what's happening all the time. The fact of the matter is that the United States is becoming sort of a third world society. Again, with this two-tiered third world model of a wealthy, privileged sector and a large mass of completely superfluous people. Now, the proportions in a wealthy country like the United States are very different from the proportions in Brazil, but the general structure is similar and the tendencies are in that direction. And this in fact, is just a consequence of the globalization of the international economy. There's been a considerable internationalization of production and investment and finance in the last 20 years. And in fact, what's called trade is mostly a fraud. International trade by now is, for the United States, what's called international trade, about 40% of it is just exchanges within a single centrally managed corporation. And the same is true of Europe, of course. Now, one of the consequences of this is that productive labor can be moved to high repression areas overseas, while wealth is concentrated at home. But that makes the domestic population superfluous as producers. And they're also becoming superfluous as consumers, because the international wealthy classes can sell things to each other. Now, the United States is more advanced than the rest of the state capitalist world, but the other countries are going in exactly the same direction. In my opinion, Europe is about a generation behind the United States. So if you want to know what Europe is going to look like in, say, 20, 25 years, look at the deterioration of the United States, because the same processes are working. See, one of the differences between the United States and Europe is that Europe had devised this brilliant idea of exporting its slums. So the slums of New York are in New York, but the slums of Europe are in Morocco and Turkey and places like that. But Europe is facing exactly the problems that the United States is. I'll give you an example from the current period. Last spring, when there were strikes in Germany, the chairman of Daimler-Benz, this huge conglomerate, threatened that if production workers went on strike, they would move Mercedes factories to the third world, including Russia, for instance. Now, the General Motors in the United States is closing down 21 factories in North America. Some of them are being moved to Mexico, where you have very cheap labor because it's a brutal dictatorship, but others are going to East Europe. Just a few weeks ago, there was a lead article, again in the London Financial Times, which is the investors' journal, which described how General Motors was establishing a huge new high-technology plant in a section of East Germany where there was 40% unemployment, and they wouldn't have to worry about what the journalist called the pampered West German workers. Get that phrase, the pampered West German workers. Given too many benefits.
Oh, yeah.
Treated too well. It's a wonderful phrase. They're given too many gigs. And that's the future of Western Europe. The opening up of the new third world in the East will simply accelerate this process. And part of the purpose in raising decision-making to a level beyond the interference of the general population is so that this can all be carried out without anybody knowing it and without anybody doing anything about it.
No, és que anava jo, havia demanat jo. Jo li volia preguntar al senyor Chomsky, com a lingüista, quin futur veu per les llengües minoritàries? Si és que n'hi ha algun.
Well, I'm called a linguist, but the fact of the matter is I have no professional credentials in the field, and I don't know anything about that topic. If you want to know about it, there are linguists in Barcelona who can tell you 100 times as much as I can. I have my own opinions, but they're just opinions as a person. They don't come out of being a linguist. And in my opinion, it's not a linguistic problem. It's a problem of power.
Can you develop?
Well, I'll talk about it as long as nobody's confused and thinks I'm talking from some professional understanding, because I'm not. And I'm saying what any of you could say. A so-called minority language, I mean, it's like groups of people can hold together their cultures, their lives, their languages, anything that makes their lives worthwhile, if they can defend themselves from external power. That's what it comes down to. I mean, there are centralizing tendencies taking place in the economy, in the world government, in culture, everywhere, for quite obvious reasons. And those tendencies, if allowed to work freely, the goal that they will reach is that the general population of the world will be passive observers, passive consumers or observers or irrelevant, without any independent characteristics, and not interfering with those who control wealth and power. That will, of course, destroy minority languages as well. So to just take a trivial example, if you're a manager of a big corporation in say, Western Europe, and you would like to advertise on television, it's a lot cheaper for you if you can reach every person in the same language than if you have to set up separate advertisements targeting different audiences with different cultures and different languages. So naturally, you'll try to get a completely uniform culture, which means no culture at all.
Hace una semana en Barcelona hubo un simposio en el que asistió Edgar Morin y Gianni Battino. Morin dijo que Europa sería cultural o no sería. Yo quería preguntarle, al margen de que es una opinión también compartida por otros pensadores europeos, quería preguntarle si eso le parece una coartada economicista o una opinión a tener en cuenta. ¿Qué opina en todo caso de esto?
I don't exactly understand the question. I mean, there are competing forces in Europe, as there have always been in every society. There are the people who own the place, and their tendency is to try to centralize, to level everything, to ensure that profit and power are preserved. That's one side. Then there's the general population, which wants to preserve the conditions of a human life. And these tendencies are always in conflict. The second part wants lively, differentiated cultures. The first part doesn't. But that's just the history of the world.
Senyor Chomsky, vostè coneix l'utopia social en el període de la Revolució i, si més no, coneix bé el cas de Catalunya en l'homenatge a Barcelona de l'Orwell. Vostè també ha conegut la dictadura a Espanya i ha conegut el paper de les forces socials progressistes en un model cap a la democràcia. Té una idea feta sobre el procés a la democràcia en aquests moments del poder espanyol, del poder i doncs del govern espanyol?
Well, I'm very old-fashioned in that respect. I still think that the ideas of the Enlightenment were basically correct. In my understanding, in my opinion, the application of the ideals of the Enlightenment to an industrial society are basically the conceptions of anarchism or libertarian socialism. And this is these developments were achieved around here to a level that has rarely been seen anywhere in the world. They were finally destroyed. But those ideals of voluntary association, popular control of institutions, breakdown of authoritarian structures, that's the direction towards freedom and democracy. Now, the problems are quite different in an era of transnational capital than they were in an era of small national states, but the principles are the same.
Si no he entès malament, el professor Chomsky el que venia a dir és que Europa, amb la seva marxa cap a una unificació, en lloc de caminar cap a un ideal diferent o del utòpic que parlava abans, el que camina és cap a un món absolutament identificat amb el dels Estats Units ara mateix. Llavors el que venia a dir és que aquest procés que ell descriu a Amèrica, a Nord-Amèrica, que és el business, el poder econòmic, el que realment controla tota la societat, és el futur que ell prediu més immediat per a l'Europa del futur.
Not very far in the future. In fact, the United States and Europe are converging only in a very special sense, namely investors and owners and elites in the United States and Europe interact very closely and have a common goal of trying to suppress their own populations. I mean, there still are conflicts between the national groupings, but those are being overridden by the international class conflict. So the institutions of, say, Brussels and Geneva are becoming institutions of the international ruling class, which of course has some national roots, but not much. It's necessary to think very skeptically about almost everything you read. For example, the newspapers in Europe in the last couple of days have been publishing analyses by the OECD of how international trade will advance greatly if the GATT agreement is reached. And they've also been explaining how the third world is going to benefit from this. Now, the fact of the matter is trade will certainly increase, but it's not necessarily world trade. If trade is between two branches of the same corporation, it's only an artifice. It's a fairy tale to call it trade. It's no more trade than if one branch in New York gives its material to a branch in Connecticut. I mean, what trade means under those circumstances is a technique for having the production in the regions that are under the highest repression, so you can maximally exploit, and having the profits go to the regions where the richest people live so that they can enjoy it. And this is not free trade. Trade within a corporation is managed trade, centrally managed trade. Even classical economic theory recognizes that a firm, a particular business, is what they call an island in a free market sea. That's the theory. Now, these islands of central management are now about as big as the sea. And the sea is not a free market sea anyway. As far as the third world benefiting, the economic statistics for the third world will improve, but the suffering of the population is very likely to increase. The reason is that it's worth looking at two of the crucial GATT proposals. One crucial GATT proposal is to increase protection on the advantages of the industrial powers, namely what's called intellectual property, meaning new technology. So new technology is to be more protected. That's called intellectual property right, which is a protectionist device. The second major idea is to free up investment, which has the effect that the major banks based in the rich countries will take over the entire third world. Now that eliminates the possibility that any third world country can carry out its own economic development program. Every third world country that partially pulled out of misery, like say South Korea or Taiwan, did it by insulating itself from the free market and pursuing state-directed policies, which is exactly the way England and the United States, Germany developed in the first place. But the freeing up of investment makes this impossible, because economic decision-making for every third world country will be done in banks in New York and Zurich. Now, the net effect of this is that third world countries, the governments of third world countries, simply become police forces to control their own populations in the interest of international investors. And that's completely consistent with economic statistics improving.
Sí, jo li volia preguntar al senyor Chomsky que quan li han fet una pregunta sobre lingüística ha parlat en política, quan li han preguntat sobre cultura ha parlat d'economia. En aquest món dominat pels negocis, quin futur hi veu per l'humanisme?
In a world dominated by business, there's not going to be any future to worry about, because the environment will be destroyed, the community will be destroyed, and so on. One of the reasons why business has always been opposed to the free market, has always been opposed to capitalism, is because they understand, and they have understood for a long time, that free market capitalism is going to quickly destroy everything. That's why business has always called upon governments to regulate and control and prevent the destructiveness of the market. Nevertheless, to the extent that decisions are made in the interest of short-term profit which means by business. To that extent, the future is sacrificed. The communities are sacrificed. So unless decisions are in the hands of people who are concerned with their communities in which they live, with whether their grandchildren will have an environment to survive in and so on, unless decisions are in their hands, in popular hands, the human society isn't going to last very long. And these problems were always there, but they were more remote in the past. Now they're not remote anymore. They're quite immediate, which means that the system of private enterprise, which is simply a system of extreme autocracy in the interest of private gain, has to be eliminated, or else there's not going to be any human future.
Muchísimas gracias.